the moment Cecil Carver rode into the dusty town of Harrow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1881. 3 different men told him the same thing in 3 different ways, and every single one of them had the same wide-eyed look of a man who had survived something he did not fully understand. The first man was the barkeep at the Silver Spur Saloon, a heavy-set fellow named Donovan who kept a rag perpetually in his left hand and used it more for dramatic emphasis than actual cleaning. Cecil had barely settled onto a bar stool, barely gotten the trail dust off his lips with the first sip of lukewarm beer, when Donovan leaned across the counter and said in a low, grave voice, like a preacher delivering a eulogy, "You look like a man who might be headed out toward the Underwood property." Cecil set down his glass. Word travels fast. Word travels fast when a man rides in asking about a widow woman with 40 head of cattle and a deed problem, Donovan said. "You the lawyer's man, the one sent about the property dispute." "Something like that," Cecil said, which was close enough to the truth. He was not a lawyer himself, but he worked for one, a man named Aldous Finch in Abilene who handled land disputes and cattle rights, and the kind of slow-burning legal fires that had been scorching the Texas frontier since before the war. Finch had sent Cecil because Finch was too old and too fat to ride 3 days in any direction, and because Cecil had a way with people that Finch described, generously, as persuasive, and less generously, on harder days, as reckless. "Well," Donovan said, leaning even further across the bar until Cecil could smell the tobacco on him, "you'd better know something before you ride out there. Tell me. Bessie Underwood has a shotgun and a temper. And she ain't shy about using either one." Cecil looked at him steadily. "Which she used more recent?" "The shotgun," Donovan said, with complete seriousness. "On the last man who tried to bring her papers from that railroad company." The second man who warned Cecil was the town sheriff, a lean and weathered figure named Amos Prout, who found Cecil sitting on the bench outside the general store, studying the map that Finch had drawn him. The sheriff sat down beside him without being invited, which Cecil supposed was the sheriff's right, and said nothing for a long moment while he looked out at the main street of Harrow Creek, at the horses tied to the rails and the women carrying baskets and the children raising clouds of dust with their bare feet. "You the Carver fellow?" the sheriff finally asked. "I am." "Headed out to see Bessie Underwood?" Cecil folded his map. "Am I that obvious?" "You're the only stranger who rode in today, and I know everyone else in this town," Prout said. "I just want to tell you something as a courtesy before you ride out there." "Let me guess," Cecil said. "She has a shotgun." Prout looked at him sideways. "Donovan told you." "He did." "Well, Donovan only told you half of it," Prout said. "The shotgun is the easy part. The temper is the part that'll undo you. She's a smart woman, Bessie Underwood. Smarter than most men in this county, and she knows it, and she doesn't have any patience for people who don't bring their full honest self to her door. You go out there with smooth talk and legal papers and that look you've got right now, like you've got everything figured out, and she will send you back to wherever you came from in pieces." Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What look do I have right now?" Prout almost smiled. "Like a man who thinks a problem is simpler than it is." The third man who warned Cecil was a boy, actually, no more than 16 or 17, who caught up to Cecil at the edge of town as he was reloading his saddlebag and getting his horse, a steady brown roan named August, ready for the last stretch of the ride. The boy ran up, breathless and bright-eyed, with the particular energy of someone who thinks they are delivering very important news. "Mister, you going to the Underwood place?" Cecil pulled August's girth strap snug. "I am." "My daddy told me to tell you," the boy said, catching his breath, "that Miss Bessie ain't going to sign anything. She threw the last fellow's papers in the fire. She said the railroad can have her land over her dead body, and she meant every word of it." Cecil swung up into the saddle. The afternoon sun was dropping low over the flat Texas plains, painting everything gold and copper and that particular shade of orange that only existed out here where the sky was big enough to hold it. He looked down at the boy, who was shielding his eyes with one hand to look up at him. "She said that, did she?" Cecil said. "Yes, sir. Word for word. Cecil considered that. He thought about the 3 warnings he had received in the space of 2 hours. He thought about Aldous Finch back in Abilene, who had said this was a routine matter of land rights, that the Underwood widow just needed someone to explain the situation calmly, that the railroad's offer was actually fair by any honest measure. He thought about the map in his saddlebag, and the 7 miles of flat land between here and the Underwood property, and the woman waiting at the end of it who had reportedly set fire to the last man's legal documents. He settled into the saddle, squared his shoulders, and said to no one in particular, "A shotgun and a temper. I can work with both." Then he touched his heels to August's flanks and rode. The Underwood property revealed itself slowly, the way things did out on the Texas plain, where there was no convenient hill to look down from and no sudden turn in the road that delivered you to a destination. It emerged from the horizon by degrees. First the dark line of a fence row, then the shape of a windmill turning lazily in the evening breeze, then the low, solid form of a ranch house that had clearly been built by someone who intended to stay. It was not a grand place, but it was a serious one. The fence lines were straight and the posts were sound. The barn was old but well-maintained. There were chickens in the yard and a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, and someone had planted 4 young cottonwood trees in a row that had grown tall enough to offer real shade. Cecil slowed August to a walk as he came through the gate, which was standing open, and made his way up the dirt track toward the house. The late afternoon light was full and warm, and the air smelled of cattle and dust and something cooking, which surprised him, because it seemed to him a woman in the middle of a property dispute might not be cooking supper the way she normally would. But then again, he did not know Bessie Underwood yet. He was perhaps 30 yards from the front porch when he heard a very clear, very steady voice say, "Stop right there." He stopped right there. She was on the porch. He had not seen her when he first looked because she was standing against the wall in the deep shadow under the porch roof, which he now understood had been deliberate. She was a tall woman, taller than he expected, with dark hair pulled back in practical clothes, a work shirt and trousers rather than a dress, and she was holding a double-barreled shotgun leveled in a direction that was not quite at him, but was close enough to communicate her intentions clearly. She was also, Cecil noticed despite himself, strikingly beautiful. Not beautiful the way women in parlors were beautiful, with careful arrangements and soft lighting, but beautiful the way the land itself was beautiful, direct and unsentimental and exactly what it was. "State your business," she said. "My name is Cecil Carver," he said, keeping his hands visible on the reins. "I work for Aldous Finch, who is an attorney based in Abilene. I have papers pertaining to the land dispute between your property and the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad Company, which I believe you are aware of." "I am aware of it," she said. "I am also aware that those papers are meant to get me to sign away this property for a sum that would not keep me in flour for 2 years. So before you take another step, I want to know if you understand that I have no intention of signing anything, that the last man who rode out here with papers from that railroad left with a buckshot-sized hole in his hat and a much better understanding of the word no, and that my temper, which you may have heard about in town, is currently at about a 4 out of 10, which means there is still considerable room for things to go worse." Cecil sat very still on August, who was a patient horse with experience ignoring tension, and he thought about what to say. He had ridden 7 miles and received 3 warnings, and he had arrived at a moment that required something more than smooth legal talk, and he knew it. He said, "Ma'am, I was told in town that you have a shotgun and a temper. I told the man who warned me that I could work with both. I meant it. I am not here to take your land. I am here to help you understand what your options are, because from everything my employer has told me, you have more of them than anyone has given you credit for." A long silence followed. The windmill turned. Somewhere behind the barn, a cow made a sound of mild complaint. "That is a different thing," she said at last, "than what the last man said. "I expect it is," Cecil said. Another silence. Then she lowered the shotgun, not completely, but enough. "Get down off your horse," she said. "I am not talking to a man who is mounted like he is about to leave." Cecil dismounted. He tied August to the porch rail and removed his hat, because his mother had raised him to remove his hat, and he looked up at Bessie Underwood, who was looking down at him with an expression that was measuring him with the same careful attention she might give a horse she was not sure about. "You are younger than I expected," she said. He was 26, which did not feel particularly young to him. "And you are younger than I expected," he said. She was 24, though he did not know that yet. She had the eyes of someone who had been managing hard things for a long time and the hands to match, and she held herself with a kind of authority that had nothing to do with age. "Come in then," she said. "Supper's on the stove. You can say what you have to say while you eat, because I have been up since before dawn and I intend to sit down." He followed her inside. The kitchen was the heart of the house, warm and smelling of beans and cornbread and a faint ghost of wood smoke, and it was absolutely clear that Bessie Underwood lived alone in this house and ran this ranch alone, and had been doing so for a while. The evidence was everywhere. The single coffee cup on the shelf, the practical arrangement of tools near the back door, the account ledger open on the side table with a column of figures in neat, careful handwriting. There was a rifle hung above the fireplace and a Bible on the mantelpiece, and a small framed photograph of a man and a woman on their wedding day that Cecil did not look at directly because it felt like private territory. Bessie ladled beans into 2 bowls without asking whether he wanted any, and set a pan of cornbread on the table, and sat down across from him with the directness of someone who had stopped performing hospitality a long time ago and had gotten down to the genuine article. "Talk," she said. He talked. He laid out the situation as clearly as he could, without the usual legal fog that Finch liked to drape around things. The railroad had a right-of-way through the southern portion of her property, which they had acquired from the previous deed holder, a man named Harlow Underwood, who had died 3 years ago, her father-in-law, not her husband. Her husband, Thomas Underwood, had died 2 years ago of a fever, and when he died the property passed to Bessie. But there was a complication in the deed transfer, because there was a contested clause in the original agreement that Thomas had signed before they were married, and that clause was the thing the railroad was now trying to use. Bessie listened to all of this without interrupting, which impressed him, because it was complicated and he watched her face while he talked and could see her processing it, fitting the pieces together. When he finished, she said, "That clause, show me exactly where it is in the papers." He took the papers out of his saddlebag and spread them on the table between the bowls of beans, and for the next hour they sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight and went through them together. And he discovered several things about Bessie Underwood in that hour that nobody in town had told him. She could read better than most men he knew, and she read carefully, going back over passages and asking precise questions. She had already gotten a lawyer's letter from someone in San Antonio about the deed, which she produced from a drawer, and it said something slightly different from what Finch had told Cecil. And she had a counter-argument about the original right-of-way agreement that was, as far as Cecil could tell, actually legally sound, which meant that either Finch had not fully understood the case, or Finch had been less than completely honest with Cecil about what exactly he had been sent out here to do. This second possibility settled uncomfortably in his chest as he read the San Antonio letter for the 3rd time. "Your lawyer in San Antonio," he said. "His name is Martinez." "Roberto Martinez," she said. "He helped my father-in-law with some paperwork before he died. He is a good man and a careful one." Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then he put the papers down and looked at her across the table and said, "Mrs. Underwood, I need to be honest with you about something." She looked at him. "Good," she said, "because I was about to ask you to be. I came out here because my employer told me this was a simple matter of explaining your options to a widow woman who was being difficult. I am beginning to think the actual situation is different from that. And I am beginning to think that if you hold to the argument in Martinez's letter, you may have the stronger legal position." The lamplight moved across her face. She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her deciding whether to trust what he had just said, and he understood why she was taking her time about it, because she had learned the hard way that men came to her door with papers and words and friendly faces, and all of them, every one of them, had been working in someone else's interest. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because it is true," he said. "And because I cannot in good conscience sit at your table and eat your beans and pretend otherwise." Something shifted in her expression. It was not softening exactly, it was more like recognition, the way you look at something you have been searching for without quite knowing it and suddenly see it is right there. "All right," she said. "Then let us figure out what is actually true and what to do about it." They worked until well past 10 o'clock, long after the cornbread was gone and the beans were cold and the lamp had been refilled once. August was still tied at the porch rail, patient as the Texas sky, and the night outside had gone dark and full of stars, and very quiet the way only the open plains could be quiet. Cecil had been on enough night rides to know that riding back to Harrow Creek at this hour was foolish if unnecessary, and he was working up to saying so without it sounding like anything other than the practical statement it was, when Bessie said, without looking up from the papers, "You can sleep in the barn. The second stall on the left is clean. I would offer you the spare room, but there are no spare rooms, so the barn will have to do." "The barn is fine," he said. "There is a blanket on the nail inside the door," she said. "And I start work at 5, so if you are still here you will need to be out of my way or be useful." "I will be useful," he said, before he had entirely thought about whether that was what he meant to say. She looked up at him then, and for a long moment they regarded each other across the scattered legal papers and the cold bean bowls and the lamplight, and something moved between them that was not yet anything either of them would have named, but that was there, unmistakably, the way the current was in a river before you got close enough to hear the water. "Good night, Mr. Carver," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Underwood," he said. He took his blanket to the barn and lay in the clean hay of the second stall on the left, with August breathing softly in the next stall over, and he stared up at the dark rafters and thought about the case that was not what Finch had told him it was, and about the woman in the house who was sharper and more complicated and more honestly herself than anyone he had met in a long time, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was not going to be riding back to Abilene as quickly as he had planned. The morning came in with a pale gold light that slanted through the barn slats and turned the dust motes into something celestial, and Cecil was awake before Bessie's boots hit the porch, though only barely. He had always been an early riser, a fact his mother credited to good character and his older brother credited to a nervous disposition, and he was already outside giving August a drink from the trough when Bessie came out of the house. She was carrying a bucket and wore her work clothes again, and her hair was in a braid down her back, and she stopped when she saw him and looked at him with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their expectations. "You said you would be useful," she said. "I did. Fence line on the north side needs checking. I found a post down yesterday. Can you handle a post driver?" "I can handle a post driver," he said. She handed him the bucket, which contained fence-mending tools rather than water, and they walked the north fence line together in the cool early morning while the sky turned from pale gold to full blue, and the cattle moved in the east pasture, and the day announced itself with bird song and wind. It was hard work and honest work, and Cecil did it without complaint, which Bessie watched without comment but did not miss. They were working on the third fence post when she said, "My husband has been gone 2 years. He straightened up. She was looking out across the pasture rather than at him. "The railroad people started coming about 6 months after he died," she said. "Every time they were polite. Every time they explained things to me slowly like I might not understand. Every time the offer was smaller than the time before. And every time I said no, the next man who came was a little less polite." She paused. "The one I shot the hat off of was number 7. That is a lot of patience to use up," he said. "I ran out of patience about number 4, she said. After that it was just principle." He smiled at that, and she caught the smile out of the corner of her eye, and something in her own face moved. Not quite a smile, but the precursor of one. "Thomas, my husband, he was a good man," she said. "He built this place from nothing. His daddy helped, and then his daddy died, and then Thomas died, and now it is just me. I have 42 head of cattle and a good well and land that has been in this family for 11 years, and I am not giving it to a railroad company for any amount of money. Not because I am being stubborn," she said, and now she did look at him directly, "but because it is mine and it is right, and giving it up would be wrong." "I understand that," Cecil said. "Most men don't," she said. "Most men aren't paying attention," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the clear morning light, and then she handed him the post driver and said, "Third post from the corner is the worst one." And that was the end of that conversation, but it had opened something. A window in a room that had been shut up tight, and both of them could feel the fresh air of it. Over the following 3 days, Cecil did not ride back to Abilene. He told himself this was because the legal situation required more investigation, which was true. He wrote a careful letter to Aldous Finch outlining the discrepancies between what Finch had told him and what the actual documents showed, and he sent it with the mail rider who came through Harrow Creek on Tuesdays. He told himself that until he heard back from Finch, there was nothing to do but stay and continue working through the paperwork. This was also true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth included the way Bessie Underwood moved through her own land, as though it were an extension of herself, with an ease and authority that was unlike anything Cecil had seen in the drawing rooms and offices where he spent most of his time. She knew her cattle by name, all 42 of them, and she knew the land by its specific qualities, where the grass was thin and needed moving, where the water pooled after a rain and which fence ran too close to the dry creek bed. She knew the sky, reading weather in it the way Cecil read documents, with practiced attention and genuine confidence. She was also, underneath all of that competence, funny. He discovered this on the second morning, when she found a chicken that had gotten into the kitchen and was sitting on her account ledger with an expression of tremendous self-satisfaction. Bessie stood in the doorway and looked at the chicken and said, with complete seriousness, "Martha, I have told you before that you do not have the head for finance." And the delivery of it, combined with the expression on her face, made Cecil laugh out loud, which seemed to startle her slightly, as though she had forgotten he was there, and was surprised to find that the joke had landed on someone. After that, they fell more naturally into conversation. Not always about the legal matter, which they returned to each evening by lamplight, but about other things. He told her about Abilene and about the work he did for Finch, which had taken him all over Central and West Texas, and she asked him questions about places she had never been that had a quality of genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation. She told him about growing up in East Texas in a farming family, how she had married Thomas Underwood at 19 and come west with him, how hard the first years had been, and how much she had loved them anyway because the land was enormous and free in a way that nothing in East Texas had ever felt. "Were you afraid?" he asked her one evening when you first came out here. She thought about it. "No," she said. "I think I was too young to be properly afraid, and Thomas was very sure about everything, which was reassuring even when he was wrong. He was wrong fairly often, but he was always very certain about it." Cecil smiled. "That is a kind way to put it. He was a kind man," she said. "He deserved a kind description." There was a photograph of Thomas Underwood on the mantelpiece, a separate one from the wedding photograph, and Cecil had looked at it a few times. A broad-faced, open-looking man who appeared to have been cheerful by nature, the kind of man who would have been easy to like. He thought about what it meant to build a life with someone and then have it stop, and how Bessie had kept building after it stopped, alone on this flat and beautiful land, keeping the fences and the cattle and the account ledger in order, fighting off railroad companies with a shotgun and a clear sense of what was right. "You have done something remarkable," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "This place," he said, "keeping it, most people would have sold. Most people would have moved back to their families. You stayed and you kept it running and you fought for it. That is remarkable." She was quiet for a moment, and he saw something move across her face, a flicker of something that she did not immediately put words to. "It did not feel remarkable," she said finally. "It just felt like what had to be done." "Most remarkable things are like that," he said. The answer to his letter from Finch arrived on the 6th day, carried by a rider who also brought 3 other letters and a package of legal documents. Cecil read it twice at the kitchen table while Bessie poured coffee and did not pretend she was not waiting to hear what it said. He put the letter down. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," she said. "Finch says the clause in the original agreement is enforceable," Cecil said. "He says the railroad's claim is valid and I should finalize the paperwork." Bessie's face did not change. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him over it. "And what do you think?" "I think Finch is wrong," Cecil said. "I think Martinez's argument holds. I think the original clause was conditional on a specific timeline that has already lapsed, and if that is true, the railroad's claim is not valid at all." He paused. "But I want to be sure, and to be sure, I need to get to the county seat and look at the original deed records." "Fredericksburg," she said. "Yes. It's about a day-and-a-half ride." "I know how far it is," she said. "I grew up in Texas." "Of course," he said. "I apologize." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. Then she said, "I am coming with you." "Mrs. Underwood, this is my property and my fight, and those are my records," she said, in a tone that was not angry but was final in the way that walls were final. "I am coming. I will arrange for my neighbor, Sam Hodges, to look after the cattle for 3 days. He has done it before." Cecil considered arguing, and then considered that the arguments available to him were not actually strong enough to hold against her, and also that he did not particularly want to make them. "All right," he said. "We leave tomorrow at first light." The ride to Fredericksburg took them through some of the most beautiful country Cecil had seen, which was saying something, because he had spent 5 years riding across Texas and had a high standard. The hill country opened up around them with its cedar and live oak and limestone outcroppings, the light doing things with the stone that made it look golden and ancient, and the spring air was cool and smelled of cedar and bluebonnets, which were thick along the road and in the meadows on either side. They rode side by side on the 2nd day, August keeping easy pace with Bessie's gray horse, whose name was Flint, and the conversation between them moved and stopped and moved again with the natural rhythm of people who were becoming comfortable with each other's silence as well as their words. He told her about his family, his parents who ran a hardware store in San Antonio, his older brother who had gone into the army and was stationed somewhere in New Mexico territory, his younger sister who had married a schoolteacher and was very happy about it. He told her about how he had come to work for Finch, how he had started as a clerk at 16 and worked his way up to the point where Finch trusted him with cases, how he had always wanted to study law properly, but had never had the money for it and so had gotten his education in the practical way, case by case and document by document. She listened to all of this with the careful attention she gave to everything, and when he finished she said, "You should study law. If you have the mind for it and the work does not frighten you, you should do it." "The money is the problem," he said. "The money is always the problem," she said. "That does not mean it is an impossible problem." They stopped for the midday rest in the shade of a stand of live oaks near a clear creek, and while the horses drank, Bessie unwrapped the food she had packed, cornbread and dried meat and 2 good apples, and they sat on a flat limestone rock and ate and watched the creek move. "Can I ask you something?" Cecil said. "You have been asking me things for 6 days," she said. "I think we're past the point of asking permission." "Fair enough," he said. "Are you lonely out there?" She looked at the creek for a moment. "Sometimes," she said, "in the evenings mostly. The days are full enough, but the evenings when the work is done and it gets quiet, yes." She paused. "Are you?" The question surprised him, not because it was inappropriate, but because no one had asked him that in a long time, and he realized he had a genuine answer. "Yes," he said. "I ride from town to town, and I work cases, and I sleep in barns and saloons and spare rooms, and there are people everywhere, but none of it adds up to anything that resembles a home." She looked at him then, and the afternoon light was in her eyes, which were a deep brown he had been trying not to notice too carefully for several days. "What would a home look like for you?" she asked. "I do not know that I have thought about it clearly enough," he said. "What does it look like for you?" "I have one," she said. "I am trying to keep it." He nodded. "I know," he said, and he meant it on more levels than the legal one, though that is what both of them allowed it to mean in that moment. They arrived in Fredericksburg late in the afternoon of the second day and took rooms at the boarding house, separate rooms, side by side, and ate supper at the dining table with 6 other boarders while the proprietress served roast chicken and green beans and talked at great length about the weather and the state of the roads. In the morning, they went to the county clerk's office, a small adobe building on the main street that smelled of paper and dust, and the particular institutional quiet of official places. The clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked at them with mild curiosity and produced the records they asked for after a brief search in the back rooms. Cecil and Bessie sat together at the clerk's table and went through the original deed records, and within 40 minutes Cecil found what he was looking for: the conditional clause, the timeline, the date of expiration. He sat back and looked at the documents and then at Bessie and said, "The railroad's claim lapsed 14 months ago." Martinez was right. The conditional clause required the railroad to complete the right-of-way acquisition within 3 years of the original agreement. They did not. The claim expired in January of last year. Bessie was very still. Then she said, "Say that again." He said it again. She put both hands flat on the table, which was the only external sign of what was happening inside her, and she looked at the documents for a long moment. And then she looked up at him with an expression that he would not forget for as long as he lived, because it was the expression of someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down. "They knew," she said quietly. "The railroad people knew the claim had lapsed, and they came anyway. All those men with their polite voices and their offers and their papers. They knew." "I believe so," Cecil said, her jaw set. "That is fraud," she said. "It is at the very least deeply dishonest," he said. "And with the right argument put to the right court, yes, it could be characterized as fraud." "Who would make that argument?" she said. He looked at her. "Martinez could," he said. "He already understands the case. I can write him this week with the document references, and he would have everything he needs." "And Finch," she said. Cecil folded his hands on the table and was honest about this too. "Finch sent me out here to finalize a deal that he either knew was fraudulent or should have known was fraudulent. I do not know which is worse. Either way, I no longer work for Finch." She looked at him for a moment. "You are sure about that?" "I made my decision about that 4 days ago," he said. "I was just waiting to see the records before I said it out loud." The ride back to the Underwood property took on a different quality than the ride out. There was something lighter between them, as though the resolution of the legal weight had freed up space for everything else, and the everything else moved into that space with the naturalness of water finding its level. They talked more freely. They laughed more. On the first night of the return journey, they camped beside the same creek they had stopped at on the way there, and the evening fire was golden and warm, and the stars were out in force, and they sat across the fire from each other. And at some point the conversation ran out in the pleasant way it did when there was no longer any need to fill the silence. And they sat quietly, and Cecil looked at Bessie across the fire, and the firelight was on her face, and her eyes were bright, and she was looking at him. And he thought that nothing in his adult life had ever felt as completely right as this particular moment. He did not say that. He was not ready to say it, and she was not ready to hear it. But they both knew it was there, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has changed enough for other people to see. "What will you do?" she asked. "After the case is settled, after Martinez has it sorted and the railroad is dealt with?" "I have been thinking about that," he said, and he looked at the fire. "I think I might try to set up on my own. Finch has given me most of what I know in terms of practical experience. I do not need him. I could establish somewhere as an independent agent, someone who handles land rights and deed disputes, the kind of work I am already doing, but for people who actually need the help rather than for a man who collects a commission from railroad companies." "That is a good idea," she said. "It would require finding a place to work from," he said. "Harrow Creek has no one like that," she said, and there was something very careful and very deliberate in her voice when she said it, like a woman placing something gently on a table and then watching to see if anyone picked it up. Cecil looked up from the fire. She met his gaze with the directness that was entirely her. "That is true," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "It is a small town," she said. "I have worked in small towns," he said. "The people there trust you already after your business with Donovan and Prout," she said. "Do they trust me?" he said, genuinely curious. "Prout told Sam Hodges that you seemed like an honest man," she said. "In Harrow Creek that is practically a civic honor." He laughed. She smiled, and the smile was the real one, the one he had been working toward for more than a week, the one that came from something genuine and easy rather than from politeness or calculation. "Bessie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the Mrs. in front of it, and she noticed it. He could see her notice it. "Cecil," she said with the same intention in the use of it. "I do not want to presume anything," he said, "but I think I would like to stay in this part of Texas for a while. I think there is work here worth doing, and I think—" He stopped. "Say the rest of it," she said. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time," he said, "and I would like the opportunity to keep knowing you." She looked at him across the fire with those steady brown eyes, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I think I would like that too. I think I have liked it more than I expected to these last several days, which surprised me." A pause. "I am not easy to surprise." "I know," he said. "So you should know that is worth something," she said. "I do know," he said. "It is worth everything." They sat by the fire until it burned low, and then they said good night in their separate bedrolls on their separate sides of the dying fire. And the stars were very close and very bright, and the Texas night was warm and full of the sounds of insects, and somewhere a night bird singing. And Cecil lay on his back looking up at the sky and felt, for the first time in years, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They returned to the Underwood property on the afternoon of the fourth day, and Sam Hodges was there at the barn, a cheerful and weathered man of about 50 who had clearly done a thorough job with the cattle and was drinking coffee on the porch when they rode in. He looked at Cecil with friendly interest, and then at Bessie, and then at some invisible thing in the air between them, and smiled to himself in the private way of someone who has been watching people long enough to know what they are looking at. "All good here," Sam said. "Old Barley tried to get into the north pasture again, but I moved him back. The rest of them are fine." "Thank you, Sam," Bessie said. Sam looked at Cecil. "You find what you were looking for in Fredericksburg?" "We did," Cecil said. Sam nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "About time someone helped sort this out properly." He set his coffee cup down and picked up his hat. "I expect I will see you around, Mr. Carver." "I expect so," Cecil said, and the confidence in his own voice surprised him pleasantly. Over the next 2 weeks, Cecil established himself in Harrow Creek with the practical efficiency of a man who had been moving from place to place long enough to know how to put down roots quickly when the time came. He took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hatch, who was delighted to have a steady long-term tenant, and gave him the corner room with 2 windows. He introduced himself properly to Sheriff Prout, and had a long conversation with him that covered the legal landscape of the county, and left them on solid mutual terms. He set up a modest office in a spare room above the general store, with a desk and 2 chairs, and a painted sign that said Cecil Carver, Land Rights and Deed Disputes, which the sign painter did for a reasonable fee, and which the general store owner said would be good for business generally, since people came from all over the county with property questions, and until now there had been no one local to answer them. He also wrote the letter to Roberto Martinez in San Antonio, a thorough and precise letter that laid out every relevant document and argument, and Martinez wrote back within 10 days to say that the case was exactly as Cecil had described, that the railroad's claim was invalid, and that he would take the matter before the appropriate court on Bessie Underwood's behalf. He also wrote a final letter to Aldous Finch in Abilene, a professional and carefully worded letter that resigned his position, and noted, without accusation but with complete clarity, the discrepancies he had found in the Underwood case and his own professional opinion of how they had come about. Finch wrote back an angry letter which Cecil read once, and then used to start the fire in his office stove, which seemed appropriate. During all of this he rode out to the Underwood property every few days, and each time he came Bessie was slightly less formal and slightly more herself, which he understood was the manner in which she let people in, gradually and deliberately, testing each new degree of openness before committing to the next. He respected this entirely and matched her pace, not because he was holding back what he felt, but because he understood that what was happening between them was worth doing carefully. He helped with the cattle on 2 of the visits, which Bessie accepted without comment but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she found genuinely useful. He fixed the gate at the south pasture which had been sticking on a 3rd visit. He brought a bag of coffee beans from the general store on the 4th visit because he had noticed she was nearly out, and she looked at the bag and then at him and said, "You notice things." "I do," he said. "Most people don't," she said. "I know," he said. That evening they sat on the porch after the work was done, as the sun went down behind the flat line of the horizon, and the sky turned colors that no painter Cecil had ever seen had managed to get exactly right. They were sitting in the 2 porch chairs, not close enough to touch but close enough that the warmth of the evening felt shared, and Bessie had her coffee cup in both hands the way she always did, and she was looking at the sunset with the expression she had when she was thinking something she had not decided to say yet. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that this porch has been very quiet for 2 years. And now it is less quiet," she said. She paused. "I find I do not mind that." He looked at her profile in the fading light, the strong line of her jaw, the dark braid over her shoulder, the way she held herself even when she was at rest, like someone who was always ready but was choosing not to need to be right now. "Bessie," he said. "Cecil," she said. "I think you know what I want to say," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I think I have known for a while." "I am going to say it anyway," he said. "Because some things need to be said out loud." She turned to look at him. The last of the sun was behind her, and the first stars were appearing in the pale upper sky, and the evening air smelled of grass and the faint sweetness of the coffee she was holding. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since about the 2nd day, which I understand is not very long by reasonable standards, but I have never been in love before, and I think when it happens like this, sudden and sure and without any reservation, it is worth trusting." She looked at him for a long moment. The night was coming in around them, and the cottonwood trees were moving in the evening breeze. "Thomas was the only man I ever loved before," she said quietly. "And I loved him very much. And I spent a long time after he died thinking I would not be able to love someone else, not because I did not want to, but because I could not imagine it fitting anywhere." She paused. "And then you rode up my drive with your hat in your hand and your honest face, and you told me you could work with a shotgun and a temper, and something about that was it was so entirely the right thing to say that it got past everything I had put up." He waited. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I want you to know that I am certain about it. I am not a woman who says uncertain things as if they are certain. "I know," he said. "It is one of the many things about you that I love." She stood up from her chair and he stood up too, and they were standing on the porch in the last of the light, and she looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, which was warm and strong and entirely real, and she let him hold it, and she looked at their joined hands and then up at his face. "You are going to stay," she said, and it was not quite a question, but it had the quality of needing confirmation. "I am going to stay," he said. "I have my office in town. I have my room at Mrs. Hatch's boarding house. I am going to stay." "Good," she said, and the simplicity of it, the complete satisfied weight of that single word, made him feel something that he had no better word for than home. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, in the way that such things happen when two people are in the right place at the right time and both of them know it. The first kiss on a porch in Texas in the spring evening, with the stars coming out, and the cattle settled for the night, and the windmill turning and the cottonwood leaves moving. And it was everything that all the careful days of honest conversation and shared work and growing certainty had been pointing toward, quiet and warm and absolutely right. Summer arrived in the hill country with the full force of its authority, baking the land into gold and requiring everyone who worked it to be up before dawn and finished before the worst of the afternoon heat. Cecil had learned this the hard way in his first summer working in Central Texas, and he had not forgotten it, so he adjusted his hours accordingly, working in his office in the cool of the early morning and the late afternoon, and spending the midday on paperwork that did not require him to be out in the sun. His practice had grown faster than he expected. The people of Harrow Creek and the surrounding county had been waiting for someone like him without fully knowing it, someone who understood land rights and deed law, and who was also present, reachable, and actually on their side. He handled 3 property disputes in the first month, 2 boundary disagreements and a water rights question, and all 3 of them resolved in ways that satisfied the people he was representing. Word spread the way it always did in small communities, not just that he was competent but that he was honest, which was the harder reputation to earn and the more valuable one. He rode out to the Underwood property 3 and 4 times a week, and the visits had changed their quality entirely since the evening on the porch. There was an openness to them now, a relaxation that felt like the difference between being a guest and being someone who belonged. He ate supper at her table regularly, and they talked and laughed and argued about things in the comfortable way of people who had found that they were well matched in intelligence and will, and were quietly delighted by it. They argued genuinely and thoroughly about several things. About the best way to handle one of his cases, in which Bessie thought he was being too cautious and Cecil thought she was being too aggressive, and they were both half right. About politics, particularly the ongoing treatment of the Comanche and Apache peoples by the federal government, which was something Bessie had strong feelings about and had thought carefully about, having grown up in an area where she had seen the consequences of removal policies at close range. And Cecil found that her arguments were sharper and more grounded in real experience than most of what he had heard from people who debated the issue at a comfortable distance. He agreed with her on most of it and said so, and she looked at him with that measuring look she had and said, "Most men in this part of Texas do not agree with me on this." "Most men in this part of Texas are not paying attention," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "Because it keeps being true," he said. They also argued once about Finch. Cecil had learned through a letter from a colleague in Abilene that Finch had been formally investigated for his role in the railroad case, not just with Bessie, but with 2 other landowners who had been pressured with the same legally fraudulent arguments. Cecil had mixed feelings about this that he could not entirely resolve, because Finch had also given him 5 years of work and taught him most of what he knew, and he was honest with Bessie about the complexity of it. She listened to this and then said, with characteristic directness, "He did wrong by multiple people. The fact that he also taught you things does not change that." "I know," Cecil said. "The world is full of people who do good things and bad things," she said. You can be grateful for the good things without excusing the bad ones. He looked at her. How did you get so clear about things? She smiled, and it was the real smile, the full one. Hard practice, she said. In September, Martinez's legal effort in San Antonio bore its first fruit. A preliminary ruling from the circuit court found the railroad's claim to be invalid on the grounds that the conditional clause had lapsed, exactly as Cecil and Bessie had identified. The railroad company filed an objection, as was their right, but Martinez wrote to Bessie to tell her that the objection had very little legal foundation, and he expected a final ruling in her favor before the end of the year. Bessie read the letter at the kitchen table while Cecil sat across from her and watched her read it, and when she finished, she set it down and was very still for a moment. "It is going to be all right," she said, and it sounded less like a statement to him and more like something she was telling herself, acknowledging out loud a conclusion she had been holding at arm's length because the possibility of it had been too important to trust completely. "It is going to be all right," he confirmed. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the ranch, at the pastures and the fence lines and the barn and the windmill and the cottonwood trees, and he watched her look at it. This woman who had held all of it together alone with a shotgun and a temper, and an iron refusal to accept that something wrong was somehow inevitable. She turned around and looked at him, and she crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and she put her arms around him and held on, which was not something she did easily. He had come to understand that about her. She was generous with her attention and her honesty, but not always with physical tenderness. And so when she did this, he held her back as carefully as he could with both arms. And they stood in the kitchen in the morning light while the letter from Martinez sat on the table behind them, and the ranch stood quiet and solid outside the window. "I am so glad you rode out here," she said into his shoulder. "I am so glad 3 different people told me you had a shotgun and a temper," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, warm and full, and pulled back enough to look at his face. "Did that really not worry you at all?" "It worried me a reasonable amount," he said honestly, "but it also told me you were someone worth meeting." "That is an unusual way to think about it," she said. "I am an unusual man," he said. "You are," she agreed, and the way she said it was a compliment of the highest order. The autumn came in cool and golden, and the hill country was at its most beautiful, the oaks turning amber and the cedar staying green, and the light having that particular fall quality that made everything look clear and significant. Cecil had moved out of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house and rented a small house on the edge of Harrow Creek, a 3-room place with a proper stove and a porch that faced west so you could see the sunsets. And it felt more like a home than any place he had lived since childhood, because he had put his books on a shelf and his boots by the door and his coffee pot on the stove, and because every few evenings Bessie came to eat supper with him or he went out to the ranch. And these were the fixed points around which the rest of the week arranged itself. One evening in early October, they had finished supper at his house and were sitting on the porch watching the last of the light fade, and Cecil said, very quietly, "I would like to ask you something." She turned to look at him. She could read the weight of things in his voice by now, and she gave him her full attention. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have thought about how to say this properly for several weeks, and I have not found a better approach than simply saying it. I love you. I want to build a life with you. I want to be at your ranch and in this house and wherever else we end up together for as long as we have." He paused. "I know you have already built a life. I know you have done it alone and that you are good at it. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking if there is room in it for me." She looked at him for a long time. The stars were coming out, the same stars that had been out over the campfire by the limestone creek, over the porch on the night he had told her he loved her, over the barn on the first night when he had lain in the hay and known he was not going to leave quickly. "There has been room for you since about the 2nd morning," she said, "when you picked up the post driver without being asked." He felt something fill up inside his chest that had no name but did not need one. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Cecil Carver," she said, "that is the most thoroughly yes I have ever said in my life." He took both her hands and she looked at him, and they were both smiling in the dark on the porch with the Texas stars overhead, and he thought that there was nowhere else on the entire earth he would rather have been than exactly there. They were married in November on a day that was clear and cold and bright, at the small Methodist church in Harrow Creek that Bessie had attended occasionally, and whose minister, a young man named Reverend Calloway, was pleased to conduct the service, and mildly astonished that the famously independent and shotgun-equipped Bessie Underwood was marrying anyone, which he had the good sense not to say out loud. The whole town seemed to come, which surprised Cecil though it should not have. Donovan from the Silver Spur was there, and Sheriff Prout, and Sam Hodges and his wife and Mrs. Hatch from the boarding house, and the general store owner, and the sign painter, and somewhere in the range of 40 other people whose faces Cecil recognized from his months of work in the community. It was a small church, and it was very full. Bessie came down the aisle in a dark blue dress that she had clearly made herself, and it was beautiful in the same way she was beautiful, without any fuss but with a quality of rightness that could not be argued with. Her hair was loose, which Cecil had not seen before, dark and long around her shoulders, and she walked with the straight-backed ease she always had, as though she were walking across her own land. When she reached the front of the church and stood beside him, she looked at him with an expression that was private, just for him, warm and steady and certain, and he thought that he was looking at the best thing that had ever happened to him. They said their vows in clear voices, both of them, and the minister pronounced them married, and Donovan, from the back of the church, gave a whoop that made the Reverend jump and made Bessie laugh, which was the sound Cecil wanted to start and end every day with for the rest of his life. The celebration at the Silver Spur afterward was loud and long and full of music from a fiddle player named Old Joe, who could make that instrument do things that defied reasonable explanation. And people danced on the rough wooden floor, and someone brought a cake that was lopsided but excellent. And Sam Hodges made a toast that was short and sincere, and made Bessie blink quickly in the way she did, when she was feeling something she was not prepared to show directly. They went back to the Underwood property that night, their property now, both of their names on the deed, which Bessie had insisted on and Cecil had found entirely proper. The November moon was up, and the land was silver and quiet, and the cattle were dark shapes in the pasture, and the windmill was still in the cold air. They stood on the porch together in the moonlight, and Bessie leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they looked out at the land that she had kept and he had helped to keep, and the silence was the kind of silence that needed nothing added to it. "Mrs. Carver," he said softly. "I will always be Bessie Underwood Carver," she said, with a note of firm cheerfulness. "I have been Underwood for 5 years, and Underwood built this place, and I am not setting that name aside. Bessie Underwood Carver," he said, trying it out. "Better," she said. "Much better," he agreed. Winter settled in around them, and they settled into each other, and the rhythms of the ranch and the law practice and the shared life took on their daily shape. Cecil kept his office in town, and Bessie kept her cattle and her account ledger, and in the evenings they ate together and talked and were quiet together, and the house was warm and full of the specific quality of happiness that comes when two people are well matched and know it. The final ruling from the circuit court on the railroad case came in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. Martinez wrote to them with the news: complete victory. The railroad's claim was fully invalidated. The Underwood property, all of it, was confirmed as belonging entirely and without encumbrance to Bessie and by extension to Cecil, and the railroad was ordered to cease any further attempts to pursue the matter. Cecil read the letter aloud at the kitchen table while Bessie sat across from him with her hands around her coffee cup, and when he finished she said, very quietly, "Tell Roberto Martinez that I am grateful. Tell him I could not have done this without him." "I will tell him that," Cecil said. "And tell him that Cecil Carver did not give up on the right thing when it would have been easier not to," she said, and she was looking at Cecil when she said it, not at the letter. He reached across the table and she took his hand. "This place is yours," he said. "It always was, I just helped prove it." "Our place," she said. "Our place," he agreed. They planted their own celebration that evening, a supper that Bessie cooked with extra care and that they ate by lamplight with a bottle of wine that the general store owner had ordered specially from San Antonio, which was an extravagance and entirely worth it. They toasted to Martinez and to the circuit court and to Sam Hodges, who had looked after the cattle during the Fredericksburg trip. And then Bessie said, with a small smile, "To Donovan, who warned you about the shotgun." "To Donovan," Cecil said, "who told me exactly what I needed to know." "And what did you need to know?" she asked. "That you were worth riding to meet," he said. She set her wine glass down and leaned across the table and kissed him, which tasted like wine and warmth and the specific sweetness of everything working out exactly as it should. The following spring brought with it the news that Bessie was expecting their first child, which she told Cecil on a morning in April when the bluebonnets were back in the meadows, and the hill country was green and gold, and as beautiful as it was ever going to be. She told him straight out, in the direct way she had with everything, and he sat very still for a moment and then stood up and picked her up and spun her around in the kitchen, which made her laugh and tell him to put her down, which he did. But he kept both hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that she described later to Sam Hodges's wife as the most purely happy look she had ever seen on a man. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "On this ranch," he said, looking around the kitchen as though seeing it newly. "On this ranch," she said. "In this house with you, yes." He pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held completely, which was something she had learned in these months of being his wife, that being held was not the same thing as being contained, that warmth and strength could coexist without one consuming the other, which was something she had always known intellectually, but had needed to learn in the body. Summer came and passed in the warm and busy way of ranch summers, and Cecil's practice continued to grow, and he hired a young man named Elliot, who was 17 and very eager and nearly completely trained now, to help with the simpler paperwork while Cecil took the more complex cases. He had also, in the months since the railroad case, begun corresponding with Roberto Martinez about the possibility of Cecil formally studying law, and Martinez had suggested a course of independent study that several Texas attorneys had followed, requiring examination rather than formal enrollment, and Cecil had begun working through it in the evenings with the same systematic determination that he brought to everything. Bessie watched him study at the kitchen table after supper and sometimes quizzed him from his textbooks, which she had begun reading herself with the focused curiosity of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting, and occasionally made arguments that Cecil had to admit were sharper than the ones in the book, which delighted her and did not surprise him at all. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her one evening. "I married one," she said. "Close enough." "Not yet," he said. "Not legally a lawyer yet." "You will be," she said, with the certainty that she gave to things she had decided were true. Their son was born in November, on the first anniversary of their wedding almost to the day, which felt like a gift arranged by someone with an excellent sense of timing. He was born in the ranch house with the help of the town doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who had set up practice in Harrow Creek the previous year, and who Bessie had been quietly pleased about from the beginning. And he was loud and healthy, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's direct dark eyes, and a quantity of expressed opinion for someone who had been in the world for less than an hour. They named him Thomas Cecil Carver, Thomas for Bessie's first husband because it was right, and Cecil for his father, and the name felt like a joining of things that did not need to be in conflict, the life before and the life now, held together in a single person who was entirely new. Cecil held his son on the first evening, sitting in the rocking chair that Sam Hodges had brought as a gift, and Bessie watched him from the bed with tired and luminous eyes, and outside the November stars were out in force, and the ranch was quiet, and the windmill was turning slowly in the cold night air. "Hello, Thomas," Cecil said to the baby, who regarded him with the unfocused but somehow evaluating gaze of the newborn. "I am your father. I rode 7 miles to meet your mother after being warned that she had a shotgun and a temper. I want you to know that she is the bravest and most remarkable person I have ever met, and the fact that you are her son means you are already the luckiest child in Texas." From the bed, Bessie said, "You are going to embarrass that child for the rest of his life." "I am going to tell him true things about his mother," Cecil said. "If that is embarrassing, that is the world's problem." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "Come here." He carried Thomas to the bed and they sat together, the three of them in the lamplight, with the warm weight of the baby between them and the ranch outside and the whole future ahead. And Bessie leaned her head against Cecil's shoulder, and he put his arm around her and they looked at their son. "Look at what we made," she said quietly. "Look at what we made," he agreed. Years moved through the Underwood Carver property the way good years do, steadily and with accumulated richness. The 42 head of cattle became 60 and then 80, because Bessie had a good eye for breeding and an excellent sense of market timing. And she ran the cattle operation with the same combination of instinct and careful accounting that she brought to everything. Cecil passed his legal examination in the summer of 1883, and the letter from the examining board that certified him as a proper attorney in the state of Texas was, he said later, one of the 3 most significant documents he had ever held, the other 2 being the deed to the Underwood property with his name added to it, and Thomas's birth certificate. Roberto Martinez came to visit in the summer of 1884, making the trip from San Antonio partly to see the property he had helped defend and partly, Cecil suspected, because he and Bessie had been corresponding regularly for 2 years about land rights cases, and Martinez had said in his last letter that he wanted to meet the woman behind the arguments. He arrived on a June afternoon on a good horse and was received at the ranch with supper and the best coffee Bessie could produce, and he sat at the kitchen table and was immediately drawn into conversation with Bessie about a water rights case she had been following in Gillespie County, and within 20 minutes Cecil could see that Martinez had the same reaction to Bessie that almost everyone had eventually, a kind of delighted recognition of someone who was simply operating at a different level. "She is extraordinary," Martinez told Cecil privately after supper while Bessie was putting Thomas to bed. "I am aware," Cecil said. "You are a fortunate man," Martinez said. "Every day," Cecil said. Martinez stayed 3 days and in that time sorted out 2 minor land issues that people from the surrounding area had brought to Cecil's attention, and offered his observation that the county needed someone with Bessie's specific combination of intelligence and land knowledge in an official advisory capacity, perhaps as a member of the county land board, which was a new entity being formed in response to the increasing complexity of land ownership in the region. Bessie, when this was presented to her, said, "Is that something women are allowed to do?" Martinez said, "The board charter does not specify. And in my experience, things that are not specifically prohibited are often possible." Bessie looked at Cecil. Cecil said, "It would require presenting yourself to the county commissioners. It would require some people to look past certain assumptions they have about who belongs on a board like that." "I have handled assumptions before," Bessie said. "I know," he said. "That is why I think you should do it." She was appointed to the Gillespie County Land Advisory Board in the fall of 1884, the first woman in the county to hold any such position, and she did it by presenting her case to the commissioners with the same combination of documented evidence and absolute certainty that she had brought to the railroad dispute. And by the time she had been at it for 6 months, 3 of the 5 commissioners were actively seeking her input before making decisions, which she provided without fanfare and with consistent accuracy. Their second child arrived in 1885, a daughter this time, whom they named Marion after Cecil's mother, and who had her mother's strong will and her father's tendency to examine things carefully before committing to an opinion, which was an interesting combination in a 2-year-old, and promised to be an even more interesting one in an adult. Thomas adored her from the first day with the passionate and sometimes overbearing devotion of a 4-year-old big brother, which made Bessie smile in a way that Cecil catalogued as one of his favorite sights in the world. The ranch house grew as the family grew. Cecil and Sam Hodges and a hired man named Vicent built a second-bedroom addition in the summer of 1885, adding a proper porch along the whole east face of the house that caught the morning light, and became the place where the family ate breakfast on good weather days, and where Bessie did her account work in the long golden mornings, and where Cecil read to the children on evenings when the air was warm, and the land was quiet, and everything was as it should be. In the evenings, sometimes, after the children were in bed and the lamp was low and the ranch was settled, Cecil and Bessie would sit on that porch in the 2 chairs that had been there since before he came, the same chairs they had sat in on the evening when they first said the real things to each other, and they would look out at the land and at the stars and at the dark shapes of the cattle in the pasture. And they would talk or be quiet in the way of people who had built something real between them and did not need to prove it with noise. "Do you ever think about who you would have been," Cecil said one evening, "if the railroad had won?" Bessie was quiet for a moment. "I would not have had a choice but to be who I am," she said. "I would have gone somewhere else, east maybe, back to my family though they are mostly gone now, or I would have started over somewhere." A pause. "But I am glad I did not have to." "Me too," he said, "for entirely selfish reasons." She laughed. "Your selfish reasons saved my property, so I forgive them." "My selfish reasons rode 7 miles on August's back and told a woman with a shotgun that I could work with her temper," he said. "I think it was about even." She turned to look at him, and the lamplight from inside came through the window and caught her face, and she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and she was also more than that. She was the person who had made him understand what it meant to be in the right place doing the right work with the right partner, and the accumulated years of shared life had deepened everything without dimming any of it. "You know what I think," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think whoever warned you about the shotgun did you the greatest favor of your life," she said. "Donovan from the Silver Spur," he said. "I think about buying him a drink occasionally." "Do it," she said. "He earned it." "He did," Cecil agreed. In 1886, Cecil took on a case that brought him to the attention of the broader legal community in Central Texas, a complex dispute involving the water rights of 3 adjacent ranches and a diversion dam that one of them had built without proper authorization. He won it after 8 months of careful work and a 2-day hearing before the district court in San Antonio, and Martinez, who had attended the hearing, told him afterward that he had argued the case as well as anyone Martinez had seen, which was the kind of compliment that came with weight attached, and Cecil carried it accordingly. He came home from San Antonio to the ranch on a September evening, tired from the ride but full of the particular satisfaction of hard work done well, and he rode August up the drive the way he always did now, in the long golden evening light. And the ranch was as it always was, solid and clean and exactly itself, and Bessie was on the porch, not with a shotgun. She was standing with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was the expression she wore when she had been waiting for someone and was too proud to admit she had been worried. "Well," she said. "We won," he said. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she came down the porch steps and he dismounted and she walked straight to him and hugged him with the full force of her, both arms and her whole self, and he held her and she said into his shoulder, "I knew you would." "I know you knew," he said. Thomas came running from around the side of the barn where he had apparently been playing, 5 years old and full of the velocity only small boys possessed, and Bessie caught him before he could run directly into August's legs, and Cecil scooped him up in one arm while the other was still around Bessie, and little Marion appeared in the doorway of the house with her dark eyes and her careful expression. And Cecil thought that this, exactly this, the porch and the land and the people and the evening light, was every answer to every question he had ever asked about what kind of life was worth building. He set Thomas down, and Marion came down the steps and took his hand very gravely, as she always did when he returned from being away, as though she needed to confirm by touch that he was actually there, and he squeezed her small hand and she looked up at him and said, "Did you win, Papa?" "I won, sweetheart," he said. "Good," she said, which was her mother's word entirely. There is something about the land in that part of Texas that does not release the people who learn to love it. Some quality of light or space, or the particular way the seasons move through it that becomes part of the people who live there, settles into them and makes itself permanent. Cecil Carver, who had spent 5 years riding from place to place before he rode to the Underwood property on that particular April afternoon in 1881, never rode away from it in any lasting sense. He went where his work took him, San Antonio and Austin, and once as far as Houston for a case, and he was good at the work and the work was worth doing. But the road that mattered was always the one that brought him back to the flat gold land, and the fence lines, and the windmill, and the 4 cottonwood trees, back to the solid house that kept growing as the family needed it to, back to the kitchen, where the coffee pot was always on, and the account ledger was always open, and Bessie Underwood Carver was always at the center of things. Managing the ranch and her board work and her correspondence with Martinez and her arguments about land rights with the same undeflectable directness that had made him ride 7 miles to meet her. Their third child, another son, was born in 1888 and named William after Cecil's father, and he was a different creature entirely from Thomas and Marion, louder and more immediately physical, with a laugh like a small thunderstorm and opinions about everything from the first week. He was, Bessie said with fond exasperation, exactly like Cecil in the most inconvenient ways, which Cecil took as the highest praise available to him. Thomas, by the time William was born, was 7 years old and already following Bessie around the ranch, with a seriousness of purpose that everyone could see was not temporary. He had his mother's focus and his father's honesty, and a quality of patient attention to the cattle and the land that was something genuinely his own, something native, and Bessie watched him work and did not try to steer him in any direction, because she understood that kind of love for a place, and she was not going to be the one to interfere with it. Marion, meanwhile, was reading everything that came into the house, including Cecil's law books, which she approached at age 4 with a concentration that made Cecil sit down beside her one evening and read with her. And within 2 years, she was asking questions about legal cases that made him work to answer them properly. "Your daughter," he said to Bessie one evening, "is going to be a lawyer." "Your daughter," Bessie said, "inherited the tendency from somewhere. She inherited the stubbornness from somewhere closer to home," he said. Bessie smiled the real smile. "That word again." "I have always liked that word," he said. The final ruling that permanently settled the railroad dispute and foreclosed any possibility of future claims by the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad Company on the Underwood Carver property came through Martinez in 1889, 8 years after Cecil had first ridden those 7 miles, and it was a complete and permanent resolution. The railroad had by then moved its interests in different directions, and the dispute was largely historical, but the legal principle established by the case had been cited in 2 subsequent Texas court decisions, which Martinez noted with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who had done his work properly. Bessie read the final letter from Martinez at the kitchen table while the children were at school and Cecil was in town at his office, and when he came home that evening, she handed him the letter and he read it and then set it down and looked at her. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. "Completely." She looked out the kitchen window at the land that was hers, that was theirs, that was in some real sense a monument to the fact that the right thing, pursued with enough patience and stubbornness and help from the right people, could actually prevail. Thomas would have been glad, she said quietly. Cecil understood she meant her first husband. He would, he said. He built something worth protecting. We protected it, she said. You protected it, he said. I just showed up and helped. She turned to look at him. Cecil Carver, she said, if you try to minimize what you have been to this place and to this family, I will get the shotgun. He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of whatever was on the stove. And outside the November afternoon was going gold, and the windmill was turning, and the cattle were in the east pasture, and the cottonwood trees were bare and tall, and the fence lines ran straight to the horizon. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 8 years, with the particular attention of a man who had never stopped finding what he was looking at remarkable. Bessie Underwood Carver, he said. Cecil Carver, she said. I am going to love you for the rest of my life, he said. I have no reservations about this. Good, she said, with that word that meant everything when she said it, warm and solid and final, because I intend to hold you to it. He kissed her in the kitchen on the November afternoon, and the ranch held them both, and the land stretched out in every direction in the long, flat, beautiful way of that part of Texas. And it was theirs, entirely and for good, and they were entirely and for good each other's. And the story of the man who had been warned that she had a shotgun and a temper, and had said he could work with both, had become something much larger and much more lasting than a legal case or a property dispute or even a love story, though it was that most of all. It had become a life. A full, honest, difficult, funny, tender, hard-working, ranch-smelling, coffee-drinking, lamplit, star-covered, wind-blown Texas life. And there was not a single part of it, not the fence posts or the account ledger or the arguments about water rights or the children's voices at breakfast or the porch in the evening or the sound of August drinking from the trough, that either of them would have changed by so much as a word.